Clint Eastwood was grabbing a coffee when he saw a wealthy businessman toss his elderly father into a nursing home like yesterday's garbage. People stared. Cameras started rolling. The son didn't care, but Clint did. And what Clint Eastwood did next would shock the world, humiliate the heartless son, and teach everyone watching a lesson they'd never forget. Stay till the end, because this story will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about family. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Frank Daniels adjusted the medals pinned proudly to his chest, his aged fingers trembling slightly with excitement. Today was special. Christmas dinner with his son Richard and the family. He wore his best suit, a proud veteran's dignity radiating from him despite his frail frame. The luxury nursing home lobby glittered with holiday decorations, golden lights reflecting off polished marble floors. Frank's gaze eagerly swept toward the entrance, eyes brightening as his son Richard strode confidently toward him, impeccably dressed in an expensive tailored coat. "Ready to go, son?" Frank asked warmly, reaching out with a shaky hand. Richard stopped short, cold eyes staring down at his father. A cruel smile tugged at his lips. "You misunderstood, Dad. There's no dinner." Frank's smile wavered, confusion clouding his eyes. "But you said the whole family." "I lied," Richard interrupted bluntly, voice echoing harshly in the cavernous lobby. "You're not coming home. Ever. This place is your home now." Frank's face paled. His medals, symbols of honor and sacrifice, suddenly felt meaningless. "Richard, please," he whispered, humiliation tightening his throat. Nearby residents and visitors paused, turning toward the unfolding spectacle. Richard sneered, his voice rising louder, dripping with disdain. "You're old, Dad. Useless. An embarrassment. Frankly, you're lucky I chose such an expensive place to dump you." Frank's shoulders slumped, utterly defeated, the medals he had worn with pride slipping from his trembling fingers, clattering across the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd as people began quietly recording the shameful scene. Before Richard could turn away, a powerful voice cut through the tense silence. "You picked the wrong place and the wrong time, son." Richard spun around sharply, his arrogant sneer faltering as Clint Eastwood stepped from the gathering crowd. Eyes narrowed, his expression a picture of cold fury. The legendary actor knelt gently beside Frank, gathering the fallen medals with a reverence Richard had never shown. Clint rose slowly, fixing Richard with a piercing stare that seemed to penetrate his very soul. "You think wealth gives you the right to discard a hero like trash?" Richard shifted uneasily, aware of the countless eyes and cameras on him. "Mind your own business, old man," he snapped. Clint took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You just made it my business, and trust me, you're going to regret it." Richard's confidence evaporated, replaced by a fleeting look of panic. He quickly turned away, storming from the lobby amid whispers and disgusted murmurs. Frank, still shaken, met Clint's compassionate gaze. "Thank you," he whispered, voice cracking with emotion. Clint carefully pinned a medal back on Frank's lapel, his voice gentle yet resolute. "No need to thank me, soldier," Clint said firmly, his eyes steely with determination. "This isn't over yet." He glanced toward the lobby doors where Richard had fled, and his jaw tightened in quiet resolve. Raising his voice slightly for everyone to hear, he made a chilling promise. "Son, you just made it my business." Clint Eastwood stood protectively beside Frank, his piercing gaze fixed firmly on Richard, who had paused near the grand glass doors of the nursing home. The silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the hushed whispers of onlookers capturing every tense second on their phones. "Hey, Richard," Clint called out, his voice resonating with a deep, commanding authority. "You owe your father, and everyone here, an explanation." Richard turned sharply, his face flushed with embarrassment and irritation. He glanced around at the growing audience, visibly frustrated by the unwanted attention. "I don't owe anyone anything," he spat defiantly, straightening his tie in a futile effort to regain composure. Clint stepped forward, closing the gap between them. The intensity in his eyes made Richard involuntarily step back, intimidated despite himself. Clint lowered his voice slightly, but the steel beneath was unmistakable. "Your father risked his life serving this country. He raised you, sacrificed for you, and this is how you repay him?" Richard scoffed dismissively, though his voice wavered slightly. "Stay out of my family business, Eastwood. Your Hollywood morals mean nothing here." Clint paused briefly, as if weighing Richard's words. He shook his head slowly, a faint but chilling smile crossing his lips. "You know, I've seen your type before. Privileged, arrogant, but in the end, men like you always fall hardest. Richard's eyes narrowed and his voice dropped dangerously low. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll make sure you regret this. Clint didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in, his voice just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. Careful, son. Threats are the refuge of the weak, and I don't scare easy. Richard's fists clenched tightly at his sides, fury and humiliation radiating from every muscle. The onlookers murmured louder, smartphones angled closer, capturing every nuance. Realizing he had lost control, Richard snapped, turning sharply on his heels and storming out into the chilly night, his coat whipping behind him dramatically. Clint exhaled slowly, turning back to Frank. He knelt carefully beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his trembling shoulder. Frank's eyes glistened, raw pain etched deeply in his weathered face. I'm sorry you had to see that, Frank whispered softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. You don't owe anyone an apology, least of all me, Clint replied gently. He helped Frank stand, carefully straightening the veteran's jacket and medals. Listen, this isn't over, not by a long shot. Frank looked up into Clint's unwavering eyes, hope flickering faintly amidst the heartbreak. What can we do now? Clint glanced around at the supportive crowd, their sympathetic faces illuminated softly by Christmas lights. He then leaned close to Frank, his voice confident yet comforting. We'll fix this, but not Richard's way. The video of Richard coldly abandoning Frank in the nursing home lobby spread online like wildfire. Within minutes, millions had watched Richard's cruelty unfold, each second fueling a wave of anger and disgust. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags like #Justice for Frank and #Heartless Richard trending worldwide, shared by celebrities and ordinary citizens alike. In his lavish downtown office, Richard slammed his laptop shut with a curse, his pulse racing as frantic texts flooded his phone. His assistant cautiously knocked and entered, a fearful look in her eyes. Mr. Daniels, the shareholders are calling. They want an emergency meeting now, she stammered, barely meeting his furious glare. Richard snapped at her dismissively. Tell them I'll handle it. And don't interrupt me again unless you want to find a new job. She left quickly, leaving Richard alone in the tense silence of his office. He paced furiously, hands shaking with anger. Every notification, every phone call was another blow, a stab at his carefully cultivated reputation. He stood by the large glass window overlooking the city skyline, breathing heavily, his mind racing. This was supposed to be an easy move, cutting off a burden, but now it was spiraling dangerously out of control. Richard grabbed his phone again and dialed Frank's number, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. When Frank answered weakly, Richard didn't waste any pleasantries. You just couldn't quietly disappear, could you? Richard hissed bitterly. Do you realize what you've done to my life? Frank's voice trembled on the other end, heartbreak and exhaustion clear in every word. Son, I didn't do this. You did. Don't you dare lecture me, Richard screamed, veins bulging from his forehead. I'll make you regret ever letting that washed-up actor into our business. He ended the call abruptly, hurling the phone across the room, watching it shatter into pieces against the marble wall. Richard collapsed into his chair, head in his hands, feeling the walls close in around him. But beneath his anger was a cold, calculated determination. If Frank and Clint thought he would go down quietly, they were wrong. Across town, Clint Eastwood sat calmly in a dimly lit cafe, quietly sipping black coffee as the glow of his laptop screen illuminated his weathered face. Surrounding him were community leaders, local business owners, and veterans, all gathered silently, waiting for his guidance. Clint leaned forward, speaking quietly but firmly. Frank deserves dignity and respect, not humiliation. We're not letting Richard get away with this. Murmurs of agreement filled the cafe, a quiet determination building among the group. One elderly veteran, medals pinned proudly to his chest, stood up slowly. What do you need us to do, Clint? Clint smiled faintly, eyes sharp and calculating. We rally support. We stand united and show Frank he's not alone. Richard Daniels thrives in the shadows. We're going to drag him into the spotlight. As everyone dispersed, Clint's attention returned to his laptop, clicking carefully through a maze of hidden financial documents. Minutes ticked by, tension etched into his furrowed brow until finally, he paused, his eyes narrowing with sudden clarity. He'd found something shocking, something Richard had desperately tried to hide. Clint's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening with grim resolve. He leaned back slowly, exhaling with quiet triumph. Got you. he whispered. Richard Daniels was about to discover that abandoning his father was only the beginning of his downfall. The flash of cameras exploded as Clint stood before a crowded press conference, calmly holding a stack of damning financial documents. With steady eyes and an unwavering voice, he revealed to the world what Richard Daniels had carefully buried for years. Richard didn't just abandon his father, Clint announced solemnly, each word slicing through the hushed room. He stole Frank's entire retirement fund, leaving him with nothing but medals and memories. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by whispers and murmurs of disbelief. Screens behind Clint flashed images of detailed bank statements, signed documents, and fraudulent transfers, each one a digital dagger aimed straight at Richard's carefully constructed public persona. Across town, Richard watched the live feed from his penthouse, his heart hammering violently in his chest. His trembling hand gripped a whiskey glass, knuckles white, eyes widening as his life's work disintegrated on national television. He felt the blood drain from his face as Clint continued relentlessly. "Frank Daniels fought bravely for our country," Clint said, passion fueling his words, voice resonating with righteous anger. He trusted his son, only to be betrayed and robbed blind. Richard's phone vibrated nonstop, texts from investors, panicked voicemails from business partners. Each new message spelled disaster. He staggered backward, mind racing, breath shallow and ragged. His assistant burst into the room, her face pale. "Richard, everyone's pulling out," she gasped. "The board is holding an emergency vote. You need to—" "Get out!" Richard screamed, hurling the glass against the wall. Whiskey splattered everywhere as shards rained down onto the marble floor. He stumbled to his knees, breathing heavily, his meticulously controlled world spiraling into chaos. Back at the press conference, Clint calmly fielded questions, his steady gaze unwavering under intense scrutiny. Suddenly, the doors swung open dramatically, and Richard stormed in, red-faced and furious. "This is slander!" Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Clint. Cameras turned eagerly toward him, capturing every strained muscle, every wild-eyed glance. "You'll pay dearly for this, Eastwood. I promise you." Clint stared him down, unflinching. "Truth isn't slander, Richard. You've been lying so long you've forgotten what honesty feels like." Richard lunged forward, fists clenched, his voice breaking with desperation. "My lawyers will tear you apart." "Bring them," Clint said coldly, stepping closer, his voice a chilling whisper. "I'd love to see you try." Security guards quickly intervened, pulling Richard away as cameras flashed and journalists shouted questions. Richard fought them desperately, yelling over his shoulder. "This isn't over, Clint." Clint simply turned back to the cameras, calm restored, letting the weight of Richard's outburst linger in the silence. The public humiliation was complete. Richard's image was shattered beyond repair, his financial empire rapidly collapsing. Outside, in the cold evening air, Richard paced frantically beside his luxury car, mind spiraling. He was cornered, disgraced, every ally abandoning him in mere minutes. Rage burned through him, consuming logic, reason, sanity. "I won't let him win," Richard hissed through clenched teeth, eyes narrowed with raw hatred. He reached for his phone, fingers trembling as he dialed a number he'd long kept for emergencies only. "I need dirt," Richard whispered urgently, desperation thick in his voice. "I don't care how much it costs or what it takes. Destroy Clint Eastwood's reputation." Richard hung up sharply, his breathing shallow, chest heaving with anger and fear. For the first time in his privileged life, he felt the real sting of defeat, an agonizing sense of helplessness. But even as darkness closed around him, a sinister glimmer of hope stirred in Richard's heart. He wasn't finished yet. Richard stood confidently in front of the bright lights of the news cameras, a smug smile curling at the corners of his mouth. Holding up falsified documents with exaggerated drama, he declared, "Clint Eastwood is not the hero he pretends to be. He's been secretly embezzling charity funds, deceiving you all." Gasps rippled through the crowd of reporters as Richard savored every second of his carefully orchestrated revenge. The accusations exploded across social media instantly, headlines screaming Clint's name alongside words like fraud, scandal, and betrayal. Richard watched from the sidelines, relishing the chaos he had unleashed. Across town, Clint sat in his modest office, quietly watching the accusations roll across the television screen. The phone beside him buzzed repeatedly. Friends, colleagues, even allies, suddenly wary and skeptical. He sighed deeply, not from defeat, but from profound disappointment at how quickly trust could erode. At the nursing home, Frank sat in the common area, eyes glistening with tears as he watched the horrifying accusations against Clint unfold on television. His frail hand trembled, gripping a faded photograph from his military days, a photograph that Clint himself had gently retrieved and restored. Moments later, Richard stormed into the room, flushed with victory, eyes glittering with cruel satisfaction. "See, father?" Richard sneered, leaning close. "Your precious Clint is finished. You're alone now, exactly where you belong." Frank's voice shook, laden with pain and disbelief. "Richard, how could you do this? Clint was only trying to help." "Help?" Richard scoffed bitterly, cutting him off. "He ruined me. He exposed my private business and destroyed everything I worked for." "You stole from me," Frank cried, emotion shattering his usually steady voice. "Clint simply showed the world what you really are." Richard's face contorted with fury, leaning so close Frank could feel his breath, hot and bitter. "You should have been grateful I bothered with you at all, old man. Now enjoy your misery. No one's coming to save you this time." Frank stared after Richard as he stormed out, the silence crushing his spirit. He slumped back into his wheelchair, tears silently tracing the deep lines etched into his weathered face. For the first time in his life, Frank felt completely abandoned, his world crumbling around him. That evening, under dim office lights, Clint calmly flipped through thick binders filled with evidence, carefully collected and meticulously documented. He paused at a particularly incriminating page, tapping thoughtfully with one finger. The accusations against him didn't faze Clint. If anything, they fueled his determination, clarifying the path ahead. His assistant, Sarah, cautiously stepped into the office, her expression filled with concern. "Clint, this is serious. People are doubting your intentions. Maybe you should publicly address these accusations." He looked up, eyes fierce with quiet resolve. Let Richard think he's won, for now." Sarah blinked, confusion creasing her brow. "You're not worried?" Clint leaned back, the barest hint of a smile crossing his lips. "Richard made a big mistake. When you're blinded by arrogance, you forget the truth always finds a way." He reached into a drawer, pulling out a small flash drive, the metallic surface catching the soft lamplight. "He left a trail, Sarah. All I have to do is follow it." Across the city, Richard celebrated, popping open expensive champagne, oblivious to the ticking clock counting down his remaining moments of triumph. Little did he know, Clint had quietly assembled everything he needed to dismantle Richard's carefully built empire once and for all. Clint stood up slowly, placing the flash drive securely in his jacket pocket. His voice was calm but carried the weight of imminent justice. "Richard wants to play games? Then we'll play. But he'll soon learn what losing really feels like." Clint stood confidently at the podium, a sea of reporters leaning forward, microphones eagerly extended. Behind him, a large screen flickered to life, illuminating the darkened conference room. "You've all heard the accusations against me," Clint began, his voice steady and powerful. "Accusations made by Richard Daniels. Accusations meant to bury the truth. Today, you'll see what he's been hiding." The screen flashed, displaying clear surveillance footage of Richard secretly handing envelopes filled with cash to unknown associates. Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd as Clint calmly explained. "Richard didn't just accuse me of fraud. He manufactured every detail, every signature forged, every bank statement falsified. This was his desperate attempt to silence me." Reporters shouted questions, the room erupting into chaos. Clint held up his hand, his expression unshaken. "There's more," he continued firmly, eyes narrowing slightly. "Richard Daniels also stole his own father's life savings, leaving Frank penniless and alone." The screen shifted to bank statements and damning emails, clearly showing Richard's deceit. Gasps of disbelief echoed through the audience as the truth unfolded. Within minutes, Clint had dismantled Richard's elaborate scheme, stripping away every shred of credibility Richard had left. Across town, Richard watched the news unfold in horror, his eyes wide, breath quickening with panic. The phone beside him buzzed violently, call after call from investors, friends, and business partners, all abandoning him. He hurled the phone across the lavish office, shattering it against the marble wall, rage and humiliation bubbling through him. At the nursing home, Frank sat stunned, his eyes filled with tears of relief and pain. Residents gathered around him, gently placing comforting hands on his shoulders. "We're with you, Frank," an elderly woman whispered softly, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're not alone." Frank reached up, gripping their hands tightly, overcome by the kindness he'd been denied by his own son. Outside the conference room, Clint calmly descended the stage, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. He paused, leaning slightly toward the microphone. Justice isn't revenge, Clint said firmly. It's truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Richard paced his darkened office, face twisted in rage. Every television screen, every news feed blasted the truth he'd desperately hidden. He slammed his fists onto the desk, scattering papers and photos of Clint and Frank onto the floor. You ruined me, Clint, Richard hissed through clenched teeth, his voice trembling with raw hatred. I swear, you'll pay for this. His hands shaking violently, Richard pulled open a drawer, reaching inside and retrieving a small gleaming object. His eyes, wild with fury, fixated coldly upon a photo of Clint. You took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you. Under a flickering street lamp, Clint walked steadily towards his car, the cold night air biting against his skin. He sensed the tense silence around him, broken only by distant traffic and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. As he reached into his pocket for his keys, footsteps echoed sharply behind him. Clint turned swiftly, instantly alert. Richard emerged from the shadows, face contorted with rage, eyes bloodshot and wild. His neatly pressed suit now crumpled, his usual composed demeanor unraveled into dangerous fury. You ruined my life, Clint, Richard spat venomously, stepping closer, fists clenched. You humiliated me publicly, made me a laughingstock. Clint stood his ground, eyes locked onto Richard's, his voice steady. You did this to yourself, Richard. You betrayed your own father. Richard's voice trembled with barely controlled anger. My father? He laughed bitterly, stepping even closer. That old fool is worthless. You chose him over me, and now you're going to pay. Without warning, Richard lunged, grabbing Clint by the jacket, shoving him forcefully against the cold metal of his car. Clint felt the sharp sting of pain shoot up his spine but remained defiant, unflinching. You think this fixes things? Clint growled, eyes blazing with conviction. You think violence erases the truth? Richard, blinded by rage, raised his fist, ready to strike. But before he could land the blow, flashing blue and red lights pierced the darkness, flooding the street with sudden brightness. Officers leapt from their vehicles, guns drawn. Freeze! Hands up now! Shouted the lead officer, weapon trained directly at Richard. Richard froze, eyes widening in shock, his arrogance shattering instantly. He slowly stepped back, dropping Clint roughly, hands lifting in defeat. Officers quickly surrounded him, roughly handcuffing him as onlookers gathered, filming the dramatic arrest. In the distance, Frank watched the scene unfold on the evening news, his frail hands trembling, eyes clouding with tears. Seeing his only son arrested, dragged away publicly, filled him with heartache deeper than any betrayal. Yet through the anguish, Frank felt a painful sense of justice, a bitter relief. Back on the street, Clint straightened his jacket calmly, meeting Richard's hateful glare. As officers led him toward the patrol car, the cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every humiliating second. Richard snarled, defeated, but still defiant. You'll regret this. Clint paused, the crowd falling silent around him as he spoke clearly, each word deliberate and powerful. No, Richard, justice hasn't even started yet, because now I'll personally handle your punishment. Clint Eastwood stood in the crowded courtroom, a sea of flashing cameras and murmuring spectators fixed on him. The judge had just asked him directly, Mr. Eastwood, do you have anything to add before sentencing? The room fell into an expectant hush. Richard sat defeated, eyes hollow, wrists bound. Frank watched from the gallery, face drawn and pale, torn between grief for his son's failure and justice finally served. I do have something to say, Clint began, voice clear and resonant. Richard committed unforgivable actions against his father, against society, even against himself. But punishment alone won't change a man. Real justice should heal, not just hurt. The courtroom erupted into whispers, confusion rippling across faces. Richard stared blankly, unsure of what game Clint was playing. Clint turned, fixing his piercing gaze directly on Richard. I propose that Richard's punishment not be prison, but humility, Clint declared firmly. Let him live in the same nursing home where he so callously abandoned his father. Let him experience the life he forced on Frank, every discomfort, every embarrassment, every moment. Astonished gasps filled the courtroom. Frank's yes widened, his hands trembling at the thought of having to face his disgraced son daily. Richard jumped to his feet, panic breaking through his arrogance. You can't be serious, Richard shouted desperately. Judge, you can't let him do this. The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued. It's an unusual request, Mr. Eastwood. Why? Clint stepped closer to Richard, voice lowering, eyes unwavering. Because real punishment means learning from your mistakes. Richard needs to understand exactly what he took from Frank, and there's only one way. The judge considered quietly, finally nodding solemnly. Very well. Richard Daniels, you will spend 6 months residing full-time at the nursing home under the supervision of Mr. Eastwood. During this time, you will perform all required duties, live amongst the residents, and learn firsthand the consequences of your actions. Richard slumped back in his chair, defeated. The courtroom buzzed with astonishment as Clint approached Frank afterward. Frank's eyes brimmed with conflicted emotions, hurt still fresh in his voice. Clint, are you sure about this? Frank asked softly, voice barely audible. Seeing him every day, it's too painful. Clint placed a reassuring hand gently on Frank's frail shoulder. Trust me, Frank. He'll learn, whether he wants to or not. Days later, Richard arrived at the nursing home, suitcase in hand, pride broken. The same lobby where he once discarded Frank was now filled with elderly eyes staring him down, whispers and judgment thick in the air. As he stepped hesitantly inside, the residents immediately recognized him. Murmurs turned to sharp critiques, openly and mercilessly delivered. There he is, the son who threw his father away, one elderly woman remarked loudly. Not so powerful now, are you, Richard? Another man sneered from a wheelchair. Richard's face flushed hot with embarrassment. His usual confidence evaporated as the relentless barrage of comments continued. Every step he took deeper into the building felt heavier, weighed down by the harsh truth of what he'd done. From afar, Clint observed silently, arms crossed, watching Richard endure his first taste of genuine humility. Frank stood beside him, heart aching but slowly understanding Clint's wisdom. Will he really change, Clint? Frank asked quietly, desperate for hope. Clint exhaled deeply, eyes never leaving Richard's trembling figure. If he doesn't change now, Frank, he never will. Richard, now fully exposed and vulnerable, locked eyes with Clint from across the lobby, realizing the gravity of his situation. He was trapped, not by bars, but by the judgment of those he'd once scorned. And the hardest lesson was yet to come. Richard's world shrank overnight. Gone were the designer suits and private dinners. Now he wore cheap scrubs, walked linoleum floors, and slept in a tiny sterile room. Each morning began painfully early, greeted by harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, mocking his fall from grace. Breakfast at 7, Mr. Daniels, barked Mary, the head nurse, her voice dripping with disdain. And don't be late. You're not special here. Every step toward the cafeteria felt like walking through quicksand. Residents glared openly, their eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and pity. Conversations paused as Richard passed by, whispers stabbing at his dignity. He's the one who threw away his war hero father, an elderly woman loudly remarked. Each word twisted the knife deeper into Richard's pride. Meals were served cold, spooned onto plastic trays. The same tasteless oatmeal, dry toast, and bitter coffee became his daily punishment. Richard sat alone, his former arrogance replaced by a quiet shame. His reflection in the polished steel trays was almost unrecognizable, haggard, humbled, utterly broken. But the humiliation didn't stop at meals. He was assigned daily tasks designed to teach empathy, changing bedding, assisting residents with their personal needs, cleaning floors, tasks he had once considered beneath him. Every chore stripped away another layer of his stubborn pride, leaving him exposed and raw. One afternoon, as Richard struggled to help an elderly resident from his wheelchair, the man stared directly into Richard's eyes, saying bitterly, "Maybe now you know how your father felt when you abandoned him." Those words haunted Richard, echoing in his mind as he worked. The reality of what he had done was finally sinking in. Clint observed quietly from a distance, noting every flicker of genuine remorse in Richard's tired eyes. He saw the shift, the subtle transition from defiant anger to quiet reflection. Frank watched too, his heart caught between hope and lingering hurt. Day after day, he saw his son humbled, gradually becoming someone he could barely recognize. One evening, exhausted from the day's emotional torture, Richard approached Frank's room cautiously. Frank looked up in surprise, noticing the tears forming in his son's eyes. "Dad," Richard began, voice quivering, "I've been a terrible son. I see it now. Every single day here, I feel your pain, your loneliness, and I deserve it." Frank remained silent, emotions welling in his chest. Richard sank to his knees, overwhelmed. "Please," Richard pleaded softly, tears streaming openly down his cheeks. Forgive me. Frank hesitated, stunned by the vulnerability he never expected. But before he could respond, Clint appeared silently at the doorway, observing the scene unfold. Richard stood in the nursing home's common room, gripping the microphone tightly. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, capturing every word. His eyes glistened as he looked directly at Frank, sincerity pouring out from every gesture. "I've caused tremendous pain," Richard admitted, voice cracking with emotion. "Not just to my father, but to everyone who watched my selfishness unfold. Dad, you deserve better. I'm here today to publicly beg your forgiveness." Gasps rippled through the audience. Residents exchanged skeptical glances, murmuring quietly. Frank's gaze softened, tears forming in his eyes, yet a lingering shadow of doubt remained. Could he truly trust this sudden change? Clint, standing near the back, watched intently, his eyes narrowing slightly. Experience taught him not to trust words alone, especially from someone as cunning as Richard. Beneath the convincing remorse, Clint sensed something unsettling. Later in private, Clint approached Frank cautiously. "You believe him?" Frank sighed deeply, the weight of hope and fear evident in his voice. "I want to. I've waited years to see him truly understand." Clint nodded, eyes fixed thoughtfully on Frank. "Sometimes people change when forced to see themselves clearly. But words are easy, Frank. Actions tell the truth." The following days brought quiet tension. Richard took extra duties around the home, going out of his way to assist residents, earning hesitant smiles and occasional nods of approval. Even Mary, the skeptical nurse, seemed slightly softened by his efforts. Yet Clint remained suspicious. He carefully arranged small, unnoticed tests, placing Richard in the situations designed to tempt his old selfish instincts. A resident's misplaced wallet left unattended, an opportunity for Richard to cut corners unnoticed. Clint watched silently, always just out of sight, assessing Richard's every choice. Surprisingly, Richard passed each test, displaying an unfamiliar humility. But Clint wasn't entirely convinced. Something felt off, almost rehearsed. Clint had seen too much to believe this transformation without absolute certainty. Late one evening, Clint knocked gently on Frank's door, entering quietly. Frank looked up, startled by Clint's grim expression. "What is it, Clint?" "Something wrong." Clint paused, choosing his words carefully. "Richard's apology seems genuine. Everyone's convinced. Everyone except me." Frank's face fell, disappointment evident. "You think he's lying again?" "I'm not sure," Clint admitted calmly, "but we're about to find out. Tomorrow I'm giving Richard one final test, one he'll never see coming." Frank stared at Clint, heart pounding anxiously. "What are you planning?" Richard's eyes widened at the sight before him. Stacks of cash sitting neatly in a briefcase, the crisp bills gleaming under the soft glow of the nursing home's lobby lights. The room felt uncomfortably quiet, save for Richard's own uneven breathing. Hidden from view, Clint and Frank watched intently from a darkened surveillance room nearby. Clint's jaw tightened as he whispered, "This is it, Frank. The moment we learn who Richard really is." Frank shifted nervously, eyes fixed on the screen. His heart raced, caught between hope and dread. "I want to believe, Clint, but what if he fails?" "Then we'll know," Clint replied quietly, his eyes never leaving the monitor. Back in the lobby, Richard hesitated, fingers trembling as he reached toward the briefcase. A note lay beside the money, typed clearly, "Take this and disappear. Frank doesn't need you anymore." Richard's breath hitched, pain flooding his eyes. He glanced around, seeing no one, unaware of the hidden cameras capturing his every move. Slowly, he picked up the note, reading it again as his shoulders sagged. He clenched his fist, crumpling the paper. Frank leaned forward, eyes wide, voice barely a whisper. "Come on, son." Richard exhaled sharply, shutting the briefcase with a determined thud. He pushed it away, muttering defiantly, "No, not again." Clint raised an eyebrow, surprised and impressed. Frank's eyes filled with tears, pride replacing doubt for the first time in years. He chose me." They rushed out, meeting Richard in the hallway. Richard froze, seeing them approach, confusion quickly turning to realization. His face softened with vulnerability. "This was another test?" Clint nodded solemnly, eyes sharp, yet understanding. "And you passed, Richard." Richard turned slowly toward Frank, eyes swimming in genuine remorse. "Dad, I don't deserve another chance. But I swear, I'll spend my life making this up to you." Frank stepped forward, his hands trembling as he gently embraced his son. The tension melted away in an instant. "All I've ever wanted was my son back." Clint watched silently, the hint of a smile crossing his lips, satisfied yet thoughtful. He knew this redemption would resonate far beyond their small circle. Wordlessly, he took out his phone, typing swiftly. Richard looked up nervously. "What are you doing, Clint?" Clint paused, eyes glinting mysteriously. "Calling a press conference. The world deserves to know what's happened here." Frank and Richard exchanged startled looks. Clint's voice was firm, carrying the weight of conviction. "I have one last public statement to make, and everyone needs to hear this." The camera lights flashed brilliantly as Clint stepped confidently onto the stage. A hushed silence fell over the crowd gathered outside the nursing home, their eyes wide in anticipation. Clint adjusted the microphone, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him, neighbors, reporters, and Richard, standing humbly beside Frank. "I've seen many stories in my lifetime," Clint began, his deep voice echoing clearly, "but none quite as powerful as the redemption I've witnessed here today." The crowd stirred slightly, captivated by the legendary actor's sincerity. Richard lowered his head slightly, visibly moved by Clint's words. "Richard Daniels made grave mistakes, mistakes that nearly shattered a family," Clint continued, his tone steady yet deeply emotional. "But redemption is about acknowledging those mistakes and finding the courage to change." Frank squeezed Richard's shoulder reassuringly, a quiet pride reflecting in his aging eyes. Richard lifted his head, meeting Clint's gaze gratefully, the bitterness in his expression long replaced with humility. Clint turned directly to the cameras, his piercing gaze locking onto millions watching at home. "Forgiveness isn't easy, and true redemption isn't cheap. It costs pride, comfort, and sometimes everything we thought mattered. But nothing matters more than family." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, nodding heads and whispered agreements spreading quickly. "Richard," Clint said, turning gently toward him, "you've taken responsibility. You've faced your past. The hardest journey is the one back home, but you've made it." Richard stepped forward hesitantly, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise this community, and most importantly, my father, that I'll spend every day honoring his legacy. Dad, you'll never face anything alone again." Frank's eyes filled with tears, his trembling hand gripping Richard's arm tightly. Turning to Clint, he struggled to steady his voice. "Thank you, Clint. You didn't just restore our family. You reminded us what family truly means." Clint nodded warmly, smiling faintly as cameras continued to capture every heartfelt moment. The community watched, many wiping tears, deeply moved by the raw honesty unfolding before them. Finally, Clint leaned into the microphone, silence once again enveloping the audience. He paused briefly, the tension thick with anticipation, before delivering his powerful closing statement. "Real family means never abandoning each other, no matter the cost." Those words resonated instantly, spreading globally, millions inspired by Clint's timeless message of unity and forgiveness. Yet as the crowd erupted in applause, Clint's eyes subtly shifted toward Frank and Richard, knowing their story had forever changed what it truly meant to be a family.